On a busy Saturday, Harper's bakery felt less like a cozy shop and more like a pressure cooker. The line curled almost to the door, adults shifting their weight, checking watches, tapping their shoes. At the front, a 9-year-old girl stood on her toes, pressing a worn $5 bill to the counter, asking if there was any way she could get a tiny cake for her mom's birthday. Behind her, the room went tight. A man in a tie exhaled hard. A tired mom snapped at her kids. And then, from the back, a voice cut through the air. "This is a bakery, not a charity line." That's when everyone turned and realized the biggest, roughest-looking biker in the room was staring straight at the little girl and at the people judging her. Harper's Bakery sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd in Riverton, the kind of small-town shop people drove past 100 times before they finally walked in one afternoon when they needed comfort and sugar at the same time. The building was narrow and a little worn, brick faded by years of sun and winter salt. But the big front windows were always clean, and the gold letters on the glass still caught the light like something proud. Inside, the air was warm in a way that had less to do with the thermostat and more to do with the ovens in the back, turning out loaves of bread and pans of cookies. The smell of butter, vanilla, coffee, and fresh dough hung in the air like a promise. Glass cases ran along the counter, filled with iced cupcakes, neat rows of cookies, and round cakes on white stands, their frosting smoothed and piped into simple flowers that glowed under the hanging lights. It was a Saturday afternoon rush, the kind that came when soccer games ended, and families decided to pick up something sweet. When grandparents stopped by on their way to see grandkids, when men in work boots wanted coffee and a slice of cake before heading home. The low hum of conversation mixed with the whir of the espresso machine and the soft ding of an oven timer from the back. Mrs. Harper stood behind the counter, moving a damp cloth along the glass in slow, practiced strokes. She had run this bakery for more than 30 years, long enough to watch kids grow up and come back with kids of their own. Over time, she'd learned you could tell a lot about people, not just by what they ordered, but by how they waited in line, who stared at their phones and sighed, who shuffled forward as if they were taking up too much space, who counted out crumpled bills like it cost them something to let go. On this particular Saturday, with the sun sliding lower and painting a bright rectangle across the floor by the door, she felt the familiar weight of a busy day in her shoulders and assumed it would be like any other. A blur of faces, orders, and change counted out across the counter. She didn't know yet that before the afternoon was over, one little girl with a worn $5 bill and one man who looked like trouble would give her a story she'd remember for the rest of her life. Her name was Maddie, and that afternoon she was doing something that felt as serious as any grown-up errand. She walked down Maple Street with her backpack bumping against her shoulders and the cold seeping through the thin sleeves of her jacket, counting the cracks in the sidewalk so she wouldn't think too hard about the number in her pocket. Maddie was 9, with brown hair that never quite stayed in the ponytail her mother tied that morning, and sneakers that were more scuffed than white. She lived a few blocks away in a small apartment with her mom, Rachel, where the walls were thin, and the rent only worked if her mom picked up enough extra shifts. Her father wasn't in the picture anymore. He had been gone long enough that she'd stopped imagining where he might be and started paying attention to the tired way her mother's shoulders drooped when she came home at night. Rachel still smiled, still asked about homework, still read a few pages from whatever library book Maddie brought home. But there were shadows under her eyes, and Maddie had learned not to ask for anything that wasn't necessary. Maybe that was why the idea of a real birthday cake felt so important. Her mom's 35th birthday was the next day, and other years they'd stuck candles into store-brand cupcakes or a pie someone at work was about to throw out and called it good enough in their tiny kitchen. This year, Maddie wanted her mom to open a box and see an actual cake, round and frosted, with "Happy Birthday, Mom" written on top, the way other kids at school described. For months, she'd tucked away every bit of money she could. Coins from returning cans, a few dollars from helping neighbors, a crumpled bill for watching a toddler, until she finally had $5. That morning, she had smoothed the bills out and traded them at the corner store for a single worn $5 note because it felt more official that way, like something you brought to a counter when you meant business. Now, standing a few doors down from Harper's bakery, she slipped her hand into her jacket pocket and pressed her fingers against the paper. Drew in a breath that puffed white in the cool air, told herself that $5 had to be enough for something, and stepped toward the door. Maddie's fingers were still pressed against the $5 note when she pushed open the bakery door and stepped into the warmth. The bell above her chimed, a small, bright sound that seemed louder to her than it did to anyone else. For a second, she just stood there, letting her eyes adjust from the gray light outside to the softer glow inside. The glass cases looked even more magical up close. Rows of cupcakes with careful swirls of frosting, cookies dotted with chocolate chips, whole cakes on stands, their sides smooth and perfect. She could see one with chocolate icing and little flowers made of frosting along the edge, and tried not to stare at it too long. There was already a short line at the counter, so she moved to the back of it, folding her hands over the pocket where the money was and telling herself not to fidget. The floor was warm through the soles of her shoes, and the smell of coffee and sugar wrapped around her like a blanket, but her stomach was tight. The woman at the front of the line was taking her time, asking about flavors and pointing at different cakes, while Mrs. Harper answered, patient as always. Behind Maddie, the bell chimed again, then again, as more people came in out of the chill. A man in a button-down shirt and tie stepped in, glanced at his watch before even looking at the menu, and slid into place directly behind her. A minute later, a tired-looking mom came through the door, balancing a squirming toddler on one hip and holding the hand of a preschooler with the other. The kids pressed their faces to the glass and left cloudy smudges while she tried to keep them from grabbing anything. Two men in bright safety vests and work boots followed, dust still on their pants as they'd come straight from a job site. The line stretched from the counter almost all the way back to the door, a thin, crooked line of coats and bags and shifting feet. Maddie felt every inch of it without turning around. She could sense people standing closer, hear the soft tap of a shoe against the floor, the sigh of someone scrolling on their phone. It wasn't that anyone was being loud or rude. It was the way the room seemed to tighten, the way the pauses between orders felt longer with each new person who stepped inside. She focused on the edge of the counter and tried to rehearse the words in her head. Ask how much, explain about Mom's birthday, show the money. She wished, suddenly and fiercely, that the number in her pocket was bigger, that she didn't have to walk up to the counter in front of all these people and hope $5 could buy something that looked like love. When the line finally shuffled forward and she moved with it, her heart beat harder, not from the warmth of the ovens, but from the feeling that every step brought her closer to being found out. Outside, a low rumble cut through the muffled sounds of traffic and conversation, the kind of engine noise that made people look up even if they didn't mean to. A motorcycle rolled to a stop at the curb in front of the bakery, its chrome dulled by road dust, pipes ticking as the engine went quiet. The man who swung his leg over the seat and straightened didn't look like the kind of customer Harper's usually saw on a Saturday afternoon. He was broad through the shoulders, his black leather vest worn soft at the edges over a gray t-shirt, jeans faded and creased, heavy boots landing with a solid sound on the sidewalk. Tattoos climbed up both his forearms, dark ink against pale skin, shapes of skulls, roses, bits of script disappearing under his sleeves. He pulled off his helmet, ran a hand over his short hair, and his jaw tightened for a moment before his gaze settled on the front windows. Inside, a few people near the door noticed him right away. The mom with the toddler drew her older child a little closer without quite looking at him. One of the men in a safety vest glanced up, took in the leather and the ink, and dropped his eyes back to his phone. The bakery, with its pastel frosting and chalkboard signs, didn't look like his kind of place, but he reached for the handle anyway. The bell chimed as he stepped in, bringing a brief gust of cold air that made the warm smells of coffee and sugar shift for a second. He paused just inside, eyes moving over the glass cases, the line of people, the small girl near the front who barely came up to the counter. Then he slid into place at the back without a word. When the line shuffled forward, it worked out so there were 3 people between him and the girl: the man in the tie, the tired mom with her 2 kids, and one of the workers. From where he stood, he could see the back of her jacket, the way her shoulders were held a little too straight, like she was bracing for something. His own shoulders were tight for a different reason. He hadn't meant to end up here. Not today. Not on this date that kept circling back no matter how fast he rode. It was his daughter's birthday. 2 years since the accident. 2 years since anyone had blown out candles. And still, every year, he found himself buying a cake, asking someone to write her name in frosting because it felt wrong not to. This was supposed to be the same as always. 1 order, 1 box, back on the bike before the memories got their hooks in too deep. Standing there in line with the warmth pressing against his back, he had no idea that the person who would break that pattern was the little girl in front of him with a $5 bill in her pocket, and a look on her face he recognized all too well. The line inched forward in slow, uneven steps, and each time it moved, Maddie's heart jumped a little higher in her chest. She watched the people ahead of her place their orders, while Mrs. Harper lifted cakes with practiced hands and rang up totals that sounded like numbers from a different world. A man at the front pulled out a 20 without looking. A couple behind him ordered a sheet cake for the team and laughed about office parties. Maddie kept her eyes on the edge of the counter and told herself not to listen. The man in the tie stepped away with a to-go cup and a small white box. The tired mom with 2 kids herded them toward the door, each child clutching a cookie. The worker in front of Maddie grabbed coffee and a muffin, paid, and moved aside. Suddenly there was no one left between her and the counter. For a moment she didn't move, her sneakers glued to the floor, until someone behind her shifted and the sound nudged her forward. She stepped up to the glass, the cakes now directly in front of her, all that frosting and color close enough to touch. Up close, the chocolate one with the little flowers looked even more beautiful. The icing smooth and shiny, the petals so neat they hardly seemed real. She swallowed hard and pulled her gaze away. Mrs. Harper set down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the counter and looked up with a small, tired smile that softened when she saw who was there. There was something about the way Maddie stood, too straight, hands clenched in her jacket pockets, that made the baker's expression change. Maddie reached into her pocket and pulled out the $5 bill. It looked smaller in her hand than it had at home. She laid it on the counter, smoothing it with her fingertips, as if that might make it worth more. She cleared her throat and said it was her mom's birthday tomorrow, that this year she wanted to buy a real cake with "Happy Birthday, Mom" written on top. She kept her eyes on the glass instead of the woman's face. Mrs. Harper listened, then glanced from the bill on the counter to the neat row of cakes behind the glass. The smallest round birthday cake she had ready cost several times what lay under Maddie's hand. $5 here usually meant a couple of cookies, maybe a few day-old cupcakes. Her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with age or the long shift. She chose her next words carefully, explaining that most of the birthday cakes cost more, and that $5 might be enough for something smaller, like cupcakes or a slice. Maddie's fingers curled around the edge of the bill. Heat climbed into her cheeks, and the sounds of the bakery blurred into a dull hum. She managed to ask, in a thin voice, if there was any way to get a tiny cake, just big enough for one candle and those 3 words, then went quiet, feeling the silence on her side of the counter reach back toward the line of people behind her. Behind Maddie, the line seemed to grow heavier with every second after her question. The hiss of the espresso machine and the distant clatter from the back, usually comforting, now sounded thin against the quiet. Someone shifted their weight so hard the floorboards creaked. A shoe started tapping, a quick, impatient rhythm that didn't match the soft music and warm lights. The man in the tie let out a breath that sounded like he was swallowing a complaint. Maddie didn't turn around, but she could feel him there. The way you can feel a cloud move in front of the sun without looking up. The tired mom bounced her toddler on one hip while the preschooler tugged at her coat, whining about wanting another cookie. "Just wait, okay? We've been here forever," the woman muttered. One of the workers in a safety vest lifted his arm and checked his watch with a tight mouth, then glanced toward the door as if deciding whether he could leave. No one said Maddie's name, but the air felt different, heavier, as if every restless movement in the line was rolling downhill toward the small girl at the counter. Heat climbed up the back of her neck. Her fingers pressed harder against the $5 bill, flattening it to the counter until her knuckles went white. She wished suddenly that she had come earlier, or later, or not at all. On the other side of the glass, Mrs. Harper saw the way the girl's shoulders drew in and the way the line behind her seemed to tighten. She had watched people get impatient over pastries they'd forget by morning for 30 years. Her first instinct was to reach under the counter, pull out a cake, and pretend the numbers didn't matter. But the memory of stacked envelopes in the back office and invoices for flour and sugar held her in place. She cleared her throat softly, trying to cut through the rising tension without making more of a scene. She told Maddie she would see what she could do, that maybe there was a way to put together something small that still felt like a birthday cake. Maybe 2 plain cupcakes pushed together with icing over the top to look like one. Her voice stayed gentle, but even that felt to Maddie like proof of what she already feared. $5 was not enough in a place where other people handed over 20s like they were nothing. Somewhere farther back, a man's voice spoke up. Not loud, but clear enough to carry. "Come on," he said. "This is a bakery, not a charity line." A few people didn't react, eyes on their phones, but 1 or 2 shifted, as if the comment had given them permission to feel what they'd been trying not to show. Maddie's world narrowed to the strip of counter under her hands and the blurry reflection of her own face in the glass. Eyes wide and bright with tears, she was determined not to let fall. She swallowed, then forced herself to speak again, her voice barely more than a thread, saying she could take something smaller if she had to, that it didn't have to be fancy, that she just wanted there to be a candle and her mom's name. The words came out in a rush because she could feel her courage leaking away, and when she stopped talking, the silence that followed felt louder than any complaint. From his spot near the back of the line, Jax heard the man's comment and felt something in him go tight, a small, familiar spark of anger lighting up in his chest before he could stop it. He'd heard that tone before, in different places, aimed at different people. Always the same impatience, the same assumption that if someone was taking up space or time, they hadn't earned it. He watched the small shoulders at the counter hunch in and knew without seeing her face that the girl in front of him had taken the words like a hit. When he first walked in, he hadn't paid her much attention. He'd clocked the line, the cases, the way the place didn't look like anywhere he belonged, and almost turned around. Then his eyes landed on the girl near the front, on the way she kept both hands anchored on the counter like she was afraid of being pulled away, and something about that hooked into him. Now. As the room went quiet around her, he saw her fingers tighten on a single bill and recognized the kind of desperation that made you ask for things you weren't sure you deserved. The date had been sitting on his shoulders all day, heavy as the leather on his back. 2 years since the phone call, since the hospital hallway, since the small white room where no amount of strength or shouting could change what the doctor said. His daughter would have been 13 today. Before the accident, they'd gone to the same little bakery across town every year. Lily always picked a chocolate cake with too many decorations and insisted on paying whatever small amount of allowance she had. "I want to help," she'd say, pressing crumpled bills onto the counter as it mattered. After she died, he'd tried to ignore the calendar the first year, to let the date pass like any other. But the memories came anyway, sharp and bright. He'd ended up in his kitchen with a grocery store cake, writing her name in shaky letters with a tube of frosting, eating one slice, and throwing most of it away. The year after that, he'd gone back to a bakery and ordered a proper cake, forcing the word Lily out past the lump in his throat. This year, he'd told himself he didn't have to do it again, that he could outrun the ritual, but his bike had somehow brought him here. He had planned to be quick. Get in, get the cake, get out before the smell of sugar wrapped too tightly around his memories. Now he stood in line listening to a stranger talk about charity and watched a girl who could have been his daughter's age try to make herself smaller in front of a glass case full of things she couldn't afford. Part of him wanted to step out of the line, drop his gaze, pretend he hadn't heard, because grief had taught him that caring always came with a cost. Another part, the one that still remembered Lily's small hand pushing money across a counter, refused to move. When Maddie's voice came again, thin and shaking as she offered to take something smaller as long as it had a candle and her mom's name, he felt the anger and the ache twist together into something that felt like a decision. Jax let the silence sit for one more beat, long enough to feel the way it pressed down on the girl at the counter. And then he stepped into it. His voice came out rougher than he meant, cutting across the hum of machines and shifting feet. He didn't raise it much, but in the small bakery, it might as well have been a shout. He said nobody was going to starve if they stood in line another minute, that if $5 and a birthday cake were the worst problems in the room, they were all doing better than most. The words weren't elegant, but they were steady, and they dropped into the quiet with a weight that made a few heads turn. The man in the tie went still. The mom with the toddler looked down at her kids, cheeks flushing. The worker in the vest suddenly found something very interesting on the floor. For a second, no one moved. Maddie stared straight ahead, unsure if the stranger was angry at her or at them, her mind too full of heat and noise to sort it out. Then Jax stepped forward, boots thudding softly on the worn floor. When the line reshuffled to make space, he ended up close enough to see the side of her face, the way her jaw trembled, and her eyes shone even as she blinked hard to to keep tears from spilling. Up close, she looked even younger than he'd thought. He glanced at the $5 bill pinned under her fingers, then at the cakes behind the glass, and some part of his brain did the math almost without him. The rest of him didn't care about numbers at all. He lifted his gaze to Mrs. Harper, and for a moment the two adults looked at each other over the girl's head, one carrying 3 decades of small-town bakery math, the other carrying 2 years of grief. The decision that had been forming in him settled. He asked the baker what the smallest chocolate birthday cake cost, the one with flowers that Maddie kept glancing at. His tone had lost its edge. It was just tired and sure. He said the girl up front had $5 and was putting it toward her mom's cake, and he would take care of the rest. From behind him came a small rustle, the sense of people rearranging themselves now that the story had a different shape. Maddie looked at him then, really looked, her eyes tracing the leather, the tattoos, the tired lines around his mouth. Up close, his eyes weren't hard. They were just worn and sad in a way she recognized. "You don't have to," she managed, her voice catching. It wasn't quite protest and not quite permission, just the truth as she understood it. He met her gaze and for a second saw Lily at 8 years old standing in front of another counter, insisting on paying her part. He told Maddie quietly that he knew he didn't have to, but he wanted to. It was his little girl's birthday too, he said. She wasn't here anymore, and he was going to buy a cake anyway. If Maddie didn't mind, they could share this one. Her mom could eat it tomorrow. He'd count it for his kid today. They could be, as he put it, birthday cake teammates. The phrase sounded clumsy coming out of a man his size, but it landed somewhere deep in the space between them. Maddie felt something loosen in her chest. She uncurled her fingers from the bill and picked it up, then held it out to him with both hands like an offering. Her voice was still soft, but steadier when she said she wanted to pay her part, that it mattered. Jax took the bill as seriously as any stack of cash, then handed it and his card across the counter to Mrs. Harper. He told her to ring up the chocolate cake with the flowers, and if there was anything left of the 5, to add cookies and write that portion down as the girl's contribution. Mrs. Harper's eyes stung as she slid the card and keyed in the total. She promised she'd box up the cake and some fresh cookies, that she'd make sure the $5 counted. As she moved to the back to lift the cake onto a board, the tension in the room began to drain away. Conversations restarted in low tones. The tapping foot went still. The man who'd made the charity remark stared at the menu, his jaw tight. At the counter, a biker with road dust on his boots and a girl with a worn $5 bill stood side by side in the warm light, and for the first time since Maddie had stepped through the door, she didn't feel like the weight of the whole line was pressing down on her. When the receipt was printed and the boxes were stacked on the counter, one medium chocolate cake with white frosting flowers, one smaller box of cookies, Mrs. Harper slid them toward the edge with more care than she usually used for Saturday orders. Maddie wrapped both arms around the cake box, its weight solid and surprising in her hands, the cardboard still warm from the lights. Jax took the cookies and held the door open with his shoulder as she stepped out into the cooler air. The sky had shifted while they were inside, the sun lower, the light softer and a little tired. For a moment, they just stood there on the sidewalk, the noise of the street washing around them. Maddie glanced down the block in the direction of her apartment, suddenly aware of how far she had walked alone. Jax followed her gaze, then looked at the box in her arms, at the way she adjusted her grip like she was afraid of dropping something irreplaceable. He asked which way she was headed, his voice quieter now, and when she pointed, He nodded once. He didn't offer a ride on the motorcycle or reach for the box, didn't move closer than he had to. Instead, he said that if she was okay with it, he'd walk behind her for a few blocks, just to make sure she and the cake got home in one piece. And if her mom didn't like that, he'd leave as soon as she said so. Maddie thought about the man in the tie and the tapping foot, and the comment about charity, about how this stranger with the tattoos had been the only one to step in between her and all of that. After a second, she nodded. They set off down the sidewalk, Maddie in front, Jax a few paces back, the distance between them careful and deliberate. Cars rolled past. A dog barked behind a fence. Music thumped faintly from an open window. The cake box grew heavier with every block, but Maddie refused to shift it to one arm. In short bursts over her shoulder, she said they didn't live far, that her mom worked a lot but was nice, that this was the first real cake they'd had in a long time. Jax answered in pieces of his own, saying he worked on bikes, that his shop wasn't far from here either, and that his little girl had always picked chocolate too. He didn't give details. He let the word "had" carry what it carried. After a while, the buildings changed from small shops to older houses, and then to a squat brick apartment complex with metal railings and a patchy strip of grass out front. Maddie slowed at the bottom of the steps and turned to face him fully for the first time outside the bakery. She said this was her place, and that her mom was probably getting ready to go to work or just getting home, depending on the day. She looked down at the cake, then back at him, and said she wanted to tell her mom about him before he came any closer. Jax agreed without hesitation. He told her he'd wait by the railing, that if her mom didn't want to see him, she could just come back down and say thanks again. And that would be enough. Maddie nodded, then climbed the stairs carefully. The box held level in front of her. Jax watched until she disappeared behind the hallway door, then leaned against the cool metal rail, cookies in hand, the sound of traffic humming in the distance while he waited to learn whether this was where the moment ended or where it turned into something else. Rachel answered the door with her keys still in her hand, as if she had just stepped inside or was about to leave again. Maddie's voice had rushed ahead of the knock, a tangle of words about a cake and the biker from the bakery, and Rachel's pulse was already up when she turned the knob. She wasn't casual about strangers near her daughter. What she saw didn't help at first. Maddie with a cake box almost as big as her torso, cheeks flushed, eyes bright, and over her shoulder, through the hallway window, the outline of a man in a leather vest leaning against the railing. Rachel stepped into the doorway, putting herself between Maddie and the outside, one hand resting on her daughter's arm. Maddie started talking again, trying to explain about the $5 and the long line and how people were getting annoyed until the man at the back had helped, paying for most of the cake and walking her home, but staying behind as she'd asked. Rachel listened, eyes never leaving the figure at the railing. She told Maddie to wait inside, then stepped out onto the walkway and pulled the door most of the way shut, so there was still a strip of wood between the man and her child. Up close, Jax could see the same wary determination in her face that he'd heard in Maddie's voice. He said he was the one from the bakery who'd put in the rest of the money, that he hadn't spoken to Maddie until she was already at the counter and had only walked behind her, because it didn't sit right with him for a kid to carry something that far alone. He kept his hands visible, his voice even. Rachel's questions came short and direct. How long he'd been there, what he'd said, whether anyone else was involved. And he answered each one in the same steady tone. He added finally that it was his daughter's birthday too, that his little girl wasn't here anymore, and he'd been on his way to buy a cake when he walked into all of this. He didn't explain further, but something in the way he said, "wasn't here anymore," made Rachel's shoulders loosen by a fraction. She glanced back at the door, then at the man who had paid for a stranger's cake and stayed outside the threshold. In the end, she thanked him, still cautious but sincere, saying she appreciated that he'd made sure Maddie got home and that he'd been kind when other people hadn't. He nodded and said he didn't want to intrude, that he just wanted her to know why a biker had followed her kid to the building. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, just his name and number in block letters, and held it out. If anything about the day ever felt wrong later, he said, she could call, and if things stayed fine but they ever needed a hand with something heavy or a car that wouldn't start, she could call for that too. Then he headed down the stairs and out of sight, leaving her alone with the paper in her palm. That night, after Maddie had gone to bed and the cake was resting in the fridge, Rachel sat at the small kitchen table with the scrap in front of her, thinking about a $5 bill, a line of impatient strangers, and the one man who had chosen to stand on their side. When she finally picked up her phone and dialed, it was to say thank you again, to apologize for how stiff she'd been, and to invite him for a slice of chocolate cake and a cup of coffee at their table the next evening. In the weeks after that first phone call, the careful invitation Rachel had offered softened into a quiet routine. Jax came by for coffee and leftover cake, knocking and waiting in the hallway until she opened the door, and he sat at their wobbly kitchen table while Maddie retold the bakery story, without the tightness in her voice. He didn't push, didn't try to slide into their lives all at once. He just brought takeout on nights when Rachel's shift ran long, a library book or a small bike part to show Maddie how something worked, and he helped with math at the same table where he'd eaten that first slice, explaining fractions slowly until the numbers stopped feeling like an enemy. When Rachel's old car started making a grinding noise, he checked it in the parking lot, sent her to a shop that owed him a favor, and rode behind her the first time she drove there, just in case. Over time, his visits stopped feeling like favors and started feeling like part of the week. Maddie began to save up small stories to tell him, about school, the neighbor's dog, a science project gone wrong, and Jax found himself counting the days until the next Thursday night pizza or Sunday coffee. With Jax in their orbit, Rachel felt less like she was carrying every emergency alone. When a field trip fee showed up in a crumpled flyer, or Maddie outgrew her sneakers again, they figured it out together instead of Rachel lying awake doing the math by herself. None of it was flashy. It was carpools and grocery runs, shared coffee and chipped mugs, a second adult at parent-teacher conferences, sitting a row behind her so no one would assume anything they hadn't agreed to name. Somewhere along the way, Jax started showing up in other parts of town too. He joined a local riding group that did charity runs for kids' programs, letting his grief push him outward instead of folding him in, and on the anniversaries he used to spend alone with a cake and a bottle, he still bought chocolate with Lily's name on it. But now he carried it up Rachel's stairs and set it on their table, letting Maddie light the candles and sing with him. Years slipped by more gently than he expected. Maddie grew taller, her jokes a little sharper. She called him Jax for a long time, then Uncle Jax when she was feeling especially fond, and every once in a while, when she was tired or upset and forgot to guard herself, Dad slipped out before she caught it. He never corrected her. When she was 13 and school paperwork came home with another blank where father should go, it was Rachel who brought up the idea first. They sat at the kitchen table after Maddie had gone to bed, and Rachel said Maddie deserved to know who would show up if anything ever happened. Jax listened as she said she trusted him, that he had already been acting like a father for years, and that maybe it was time to make that promise official. They didn't rush. They talked to Maddie, explained that legal adoption wouldn't erase the father she'd started life with, or the girl Jax had lost, but it would put in writing what they were already living. Maddie thought about it and said she liked the sound of official, that it made everything feel less fragile. Months later, when the process finally went through, there was no big party, no balloons, just the three of them walking out of a courthouse into bright afternoon light. A thin stack of signed forms in Rachel's bag, and a quiet sense that a line had been drawn around their little unit. Jax looked at Maddie and saw, for the first time since Lily died, a future that didn't end at the edge of his grief, but stretched out past it, with room for more than one kind of daughter. Years later, Maddie would tell the story in a place that looked nothing like Harper's bakery and yet carried a similar kind of warmth. It was a Saturday in late summer, the kind of day made for open roads and loud engines. A local park had been taken over by rows of motorcycles and folding tables, banners for a kids' charity flapping in the breeze. There were grills smoking in one corner, a bouncy house in another, and a small stage with a simple microphone and a hand-lettered sign that read, "Community Stories." Maddie stood just off to the side, a volunteer badge clipped to her shirt. Her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than the 9-year-old who'd once counted sidewalk cracks on Maple Street. Jax was nearby, talking with a knot of other riders in their vests, all patches and leather and sunburned faces, but every so often his eyes drifted back to her like a habit he hadn't broken. When it was her turn, she walked up the wooden steps and took her place at the mic, papers in hand, even though she hardly looked at them. She talked about the charity first, about why after-school programs and meal vouchers for kids mattered, how some families needed a little help stretching between paychecks. Then she said there was a reason she cared so much, a story that started in a different kind of line on a different kind of Saturday. In clean, steady sentences, she told them about being 9 years old with $5 in her pocket and an idea of what a real birthday cake should look like. She described the warm bakery, the long line, the sound of a shoe tapping behind her, the way grown-ups could make a child feel small without ever saying her name. She talked about Mrs. Harper choosing her words carefully, about the bill under her fingers, about the comment from the back that had made her want to disappear. And then she told them about the man in the leather vest, who had stepped into the silence, not to rush her, but to remind everyone that a minute of their time wasn't worth more than a kid's birthday wish. She said he'd put his card down next to her crumpled 5 and called her a teammate, walked behind her all the way home and stopped at the railing because he understood that trust didn't show up just because you'd done one kind thing. She didn't linger on paperwork or court dates, but she explained that over the years, he had become the one who showed up. For math homework, car trouble, field trip forms, and the quiet, heavy days when grief sat low in her mother's chest and another adult needed to be in the room. At some point, she said, the word official had attached itself to what they were already living, that a judge had signed something, and now there was a line on her documents that said father where there had once been a blank. She glanced toward the edge of the crowd, then, just long enough to meet Jax's eyes, before looking back at the people on folding chairs and blankets. She told them that if you had seen him that first day, dust on his boots, tattoos up his arms, grief sitting heavy on his shoulders, you might have pulled your kid a little closer. You might have believed the worst thing about him on sight and never learned the best. What she had learned, standing at a bakery counter with $5 and not nearly enough courage, was that appearances were the thinnest part of any story. The thickest parts, the ones that held lives together, were made of the choices people made when no one was rewarding them for it. choosing to stand in front of a child instead of behind a complaint, choosing to walk a few extra blocks behind a girl with a cake, choosing to show up again and again until a stranger quietly became family. She didn't finish with a grand quote or a lecture about kindness. She simply said that a biker in a long line at a bakery had decided to share his birthday cake with a scared kid and her exhausted mother. And because of that, she now had both a story and a father she wouldn't have had otherwise. In the back of the crowd, Mrs. Harper, older now, her daughter running the bakery, dabbed at her eyes, still a little amazed that an ordinary Saturday rush had turned into something people told at fundraisers. Jax stood with his arms loosely folded, jaw working, pretending the sun was the reason his eyes were wet. The bakery on Maple and 3rd still sold chocolate cakes with white frosting flowers, and every year on the same week, they boxed one up with 2 names in careful icing, one for the girl he had lost, and one for the girl who had turned $5 and a shared cake into a life where none of them had to stand in line alone anymore.